The Chinese Communist Party, also known as the CCP, has been through its fair share of controversies. For millions of Chinese citizens, the party reminds them of triumph in a civil form and the start of stability and economic welfare for the nation. But for many, the CCP is a questionable body, especially when it comes to human rights abuses. For years, China's population has stepped out in protest of programs implemented by the CCP. And while things always seemed to mellow down after a bit, it looks like the time is finally up. So, is Xi Jinping's reign really coming to an end? In this video, we're taking a look at why CCP is scared of so many protests taking place in China at the moment. Starting with Xi's legacy. China has gone through a lot in the past couple of years, with the COVID-19 virus originating in China to reports of countless human rights violations. The CCP has been under fire for a while now. When it comes to protests in general, China has always been a nation where people are scared to come out on the streets, especially since President Xi has taken control. Since 2012, Xi is known to be involved with the arrests of countless NGO workers, independent lawyers, and activists. Whether it's his stringent birth control and sterilization policies, to forced labor and violations of religious freedom, large protests have always been squashed pretty early on in the nation. But over the years, the protests against Xi and his abuse of power have been gradually increasing in number and intensity, leading people to believe that his regime might be under threat. But the truth is that Xi has no shortage of support, and that has given him the upper hand in this battle for a long time. But the zero-COVID policy has proven to become his undoing, or at least the start of it. But what is zero-COVID? China was the first country to go into lockdown after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And well, it made sense, since that's where the virus originated. But 2 years into it, the whole world is almost going back to the way it was. We've gone from the new normal to the mostly old normal. Of course, that doesn't mean COVID is gone. It just means that the virus is less frequent and way less deadly after all the variations it has been through. And China has been no different. But in November 2022, it felt like the entirety of China had stepped out of their homes in protest of their president's zero-COVID policy. While the police tried their best to send the protesters away, people kept rallying in China's financial capital, calling for Xi Jinping's resignation. But why exactly were they doing that? Let's look at it this way. Years after COVID first emerged, China is still the only country taking active measures to stop transmission. Some might call it vigilant, but some might call it extreme too. China's zero-COVID policy is aimed at completely eradicating the disease from the country. But how will that be achieved? Well, President Xi, who has declared himself the people's warrior in the battle against COVID, instructed his Politburo to take any measures necessary to achieve zero-COVID. This resulted in millions of people being confined to their homes for weeks without any reason. For example, residents all over Shanghai were forcefully detained in quarantine facilities last summer because of a single case in a neighboring housing block. And all of that just didn't seem fair to anyone. Under the policy, CCP and Xi would make constant testing mandatory, turning China into some dystopian kind of state where people were constantly monitored, surveilled, and kept away from each other, even when there were no legitimate signs of danger. The response to zero-COVID. When a leader has the power that Xi does, the people rarely ever contest it, so thousands of people all over China accepted the extreme health measures since they technically were minimizing deaths, while other countries went through waves upon waves of infection. But that view didn't really hold for long. The unrest started to spread across the country when 10 people died in a fire in an apartment building, and their rescue was delayed because of the lockdown measures. People soon started realizing that the zero-COVID policy might just be doing more harm than good. And that's all it took for protests to start. The people of China had reached their breaking point. The protesters were blatantly calling for Jinping's resignation and the end of the CCP's rule. And no matter how hard the police tried to disband them, they kept coming together again and again, spreading their word on social media. The protests spread out to other cities, including Beijing and even university campuses. And because large-scale protests are so rare in China, this was truly an unprecedented event, especially considering the fact Xi is one of the most powerful leaders the country has ever seen. And for people to be going up against him like this was truly a sight to behold. Going back to the past. These protests encouraged people to open up more about the ruling Communist Party and how it's been involved in tons of ugly practices over the years. A topic that was frequently brought up was the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, where the CCP ordered their troops to open fire on pro-democracy student protesters. And well, the entire Pandora's box opened after that. The zero-COVID protesters starting asking the CCP to officially apologize for the deaths in the massacre. Some also called for an apology for the deaths in the fire in Urumqi, in the Xinjiang region, along with all the atrocities and ethnic violence being carried out in Uyghur. Not to mention that zero COVID also cost the Chinese economy over $384 billion and reduced GDP growth by 2.2%. So the policy didn't even make sense on that front. Zero COVID, no more. In the wake of all these protests, Xi decided to overturn the notorious zero COVID policy, but it was pretty much like putting a band-aid over a gaping wound. Let's break it all down. Right after the protests, Chinese security services tracked down and detained tons of protesters, despite the fact they were never part of any union or political body. Rumor has it that these protests had Xi a bit spooked, if we're being honest. The demonstrators included all kinds of people, from affluent Shanghainese to students and migrant workers. It was as if the entire country was united in its battle against Xi and his inhumane decisions. Of course, the financial consequences factored in here too, but what most people weren't prepared for was the fact that things wouldn't go back to normal after the policy was overturned. The problem runs deep. If anything, Xi's U-turn with zero COVID actually exposed how fragile China's healthcare system is at this point. The truth is that China has been struggling for a while, and consistent lockdowns just aren't the answer to the problem here. First of all, the CCP stopped recording COVID-19 infections that were asymptomatic on December 14, 2022. This, of course, caused a huge disparity in information and essentially helped the party downplay the number of people infected with the deadly disease. And that isn't it. The reports also say that the official COVID death tally includes people who have contracted COVID and then have died of respiratory failure. Anything else isn't counted as death by COVID. So, of course, with these numbers, it's easy for the CCP to claim that China has endured the lowest COVID-19 death toll out of all the countries in the world. In the wake of all this, CCP has tried to push their own propaganda, saying that the zero-COVID strategy was necessary to give the country time to develop effective treatments. But obviously, that just isn't true. A public health disaster. Some doctors believe that China's medical institutions will soon witness their darkest hour with virtually no community exposure to the virus, along with low-efficacy domestic vaccines. With the zero-COVID lockdowns easing up and cases on the rise, doctors predict over 1 million deaths in the coming few months in China. Not just that, but currently, only 42% of the country's over 80 population has had 3 doses of the vaccine, and most of that number includes government figures. Tons of people looking for booster shots are now being turned away from Chinese health institutions because of a lack of supply, which is only expected to get worse with inflation. At a time like this, it would make sense to import international vaccines for the most vulnerable groups of people. And the US even offered China its mRNA vaccines, but of course, the CCP is way too nationalistic to ever accept the offer. So now, not only have they run out of vaccines, they're refusing external help and haven't stockpiled antivirals either. Public health experts have called this a nightmare, saying that the opening up of lockdowns without any planning to curb the virus or reduce infections is going to be deadly. Experts believe that, contrary to the CCP's statement, this overturn of the policy wasn't planned at all and is only a move for them to save face, despite the fact that it's putting tons of people at risk. The end of CCP as we know it. Considering all of this, it's pretty obvious that Xi and the CCP have put themselves in a tricky situation with all the chinks in the armor being revealed. All we can do is wait and watch if this is it for President Xi and the CCP. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon. Make sure to watch the next video.